Your dog used to follow you everywhere. It didn't matter where you went, they were already there before you even noticed. Room to room, step by step, always close, always aware. And then one day, without warning, that starts to change. At first, it doesn't feel like a big deal. They stay behind for a few seconds longer than usual. Maybe they don't get up immediately when you move, and you assume they're just tired, distracted, or comfortable where they are. But then it happens again, and again. And slowly, something that used to feel automatic starts to feel inconsistent. Not gone, but different. Because a dog that follows closely is not just being affectionate. It is responding to something deeper than attachment. It is tracking movement, awareness, and connection in real time. Following is not random behavior. It is a reflection of how closely your dog is tuned into you. It shows how clearly your presence stands out in their environment, and it reveals how important your movement is within their world. So when that changes, it is never accidental. It means something has shifted in how your dog is processing you. Not emotionally in the way people assume, but behaviorally. At first, the difference is almost invisible. You stand up, and instead of moving instantly, your dog watches. There's a slight delay, a moment of stillness before they decide. And sometimes, they don't follow at all. That moment matters more than it seems, because what you're seeing is not a lack of interest. It is the beginning of evaluation. Your dog is no longer moving automatically, it is deciding whether to move. And that decision is based on what it has learned from repeated experience. And this is where most owners misunderstand what's happening. They think the dog is becoming independent or relaxed. They assume it's a sign of comfort, but comfort does not create distance in this way. What you're seeing is a shift in priority. Your movement is no longer the most important signal in the environment. Something else has started to compete with it. And once that happens, following becomes optional. Not consciously, but structurally. The dog is no longer compelled to stay aligned in the same way. And this is where most owners misread what they're seeing. Because the dog still follows sometimes, it feels like nothing has really changed. But the consistency is already gone, and consistency is what holds behavior in place. Once that breaks, everything else begins to loosen with it. The dog is no longer responding from habit. It is responding from decision. And that decision introduces delay. That's why this moment matters more than it looks. Because your dog is no longer moving with you, it is moving after deciding. And that difference may feel small, but it changes the entire structure of the relationship. At first, the change is subtle. The dog still follows, just not as quickly. It still stays close, just not as consistently. And because nothing feels obviously wrong, it goes unnoticed. But behavior does not stay in this middle state. It moves in a direction. And that direction becomes clearer over time. Because once a dog begins to hesitate before following, it begins to evaluate every movement. It watches, processes, and decides instead of reacting instantly. And that process creates distance. Not physical distance at first, but decision-based distance. A gap between your movement and their response. A gap that didn't exist before. And this is where the shift deepens. Because once that gap appears, it begins to grow. Not suddenly, but steadily, through repetition. You may start to notice the dog staying behind in certain situations. Maybe when something else is happening nearby. Maybe when the environment feels more interesting. Or maybe for no obvious reason at all. But there is always a reason. Because dogs don't ignore movement randomly. They prioritize based on what has been reinforced over time. If following you consistently leads to nothing meaningful, the behavior weakens. Not emotionally, but functionally. The dog begins to conserve energy and choose when movement is worth matching. And this is the moment most people overlook. Because the dog is still following sometimes. Still staying close at times. Still appearing connected in certain situations. But the consistency is gone. And consistency is what defines the behavior. And this is where most owners feel something is different, but can't explain it. The dog hasn't changed dramatically. It hasn't become distant in an obvious way. But the connection feels less automatic. Because what has changed is not affection, it is alignment. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because once alignment weakens, every behavior connected to it begins to adjust. Response time changes, attention changes, and engagement changes. And following is often the first place this becomes visible. Not because it matters most, but because it happens constantly throughout the day. It is one of the clearest indicators of connection. And this is where the pressure begins to build, even if it's not obvious yet. Because once the dog starts choosing when to follow, it starts choosing in other areas too. The same decision-making process begins to spread. It affects how the dog responds to calls, how it reacts to cues, how quickly it re-engages after distraction. And by the time those changes become obvious, the process has already been in motion for a while. But it all started with something small. A moment where your dog watched and didn't move. Because that moment represents a shift from automatic response to selective response, from alignment to evaluation. And once that shift happens, behavior begins to reorganize around it. You may notice the dog watching you more instead of following immediately, observing before acting, waiting before moving. And this waiting is not confusion, it is calculation. The dog is reading the situation, interpreting your movement, deciding what matters. And this is where most owners begin to feel the disconnect. Not because the dog has stopped caring, but because the response no longer feels synchronized. There is a delay now, a gap, a moment where the connection used to be instant. Because when a dog is fully aligned, movement is shared. It happens together, without hesitation. But when alignment shifts, movement separates. You go first, and the dog follows later. Or sometimes, not at all. And that difference is what you're noticing. And this is where the shift becomes permanent if nothing interrupts it. Because once a dog fully transitions into choosing when to follow, that behavior stabilizes. It no longer feels new or temporary, it becomes the default way the dog responds to you. And at that point, the original automatic connection is no longer what the dog relies on. That's why this stage matters more than the beginning. Because early hesitation is flexible, but repeated hesitation becomes structure. And once behavior becomes structure, it does not change on its own. It continues in the same direction unless something resets how the dog interprets your movement. Because what you're seeing is not random. It is the result of how your dog now interprets your movement, your presence, and your importance in the environment. And that interpretation is built slowly, through repeated experience, not in a single moment. So the next time you stand up and your dog doesn't follow immediately, watch carefully. Not just for whether they come, but for what happens before they move. Because in that moment, your dog is showing you exactly how it sees you now.